It started quietly, almost innocently. The first time I saw an unfamiliar SUV in my parking spot, I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe a visitor had confused the numbered spaces. Maybe a delivery driver was taking a quick break. But the next evening it was there again, and the next morning still parked as if it belonged there. In my neighborhood, parking wasn't just a convenience, it was survival. Every home had a single assigned space, a thin strip of asphalt bearing painted numbers that matched your house. Without it, you were left to hunt for street parking blocks away, often walking home in the dark. And this SUV, with its shiny silver paint and spotless tires, had claimed my space as its new home. I checked the HOA rules again, just to be certain. My deed showed clearly, spot 47 belonged to me, it was mine, and had been since I moved in. Yet here I was, circling the block at night like a vulture, hoping to catch a sliver of curb space. The first week, I tried to be patient. I waited for someone to come out. I even left a polite note on the windshield explaining the mix-up. But by the following Monday, the note had been crumpled and tossed under the car. The SUV was still there, now parked at a smug angle, taking up the space as if to mock me. That was when I first saw her. She emerged from one of the corner townhouses, her keys jingling in her hand, sunglasses perched high on her head despite the overcast sky. She glanced at me briefly before climbing into the SUV. No wave, no acknowledgement, just a sharp turn of the wheel as she sped off. It wasn't hard to find out who she was. Her name was Karen, an HOA regular, the kind of person who seemed to treat the rulebook as her personal weapon. I'd heard murmurs about her at neighborhood gatherings, complaints about lawn heights, garbage bins placed an inch too far from the curb, and noise violations for children laughing past 7 p.m. She was a known force, and now she had set her sights, or rather, her tires on me. When she returned that evening and parked in my spot again, I confronted the HOA president. He sighed, rubbed his temples, and admitted that Karen had been temporarily reassigned my space due to construction near her home. I pointed out there was no construction, just a clean, empty driveway in front of her house. He avoided eye contact and promised to look into it. Weeks passed, and nothing changed. Every night her SUV sat smugly in my spot. Every morning I trudged from 2 blocks away, rain soaking my jacket, groceries digging into my arms. I began to notice other neighbors giving me sympathetic glances, whispering as I passed. They all knew Karen, and they knew she wasn't giving up my space anytime soon. I could have fought it the usual way. Letters to the HOA, complaints to the city, maybe even small claims court. But the problem with those routes was time, and the fact that Karen thrived in bureaucracy. She would drag the process out for months, maybe years, all while enjoying her stolen spot. So instead, I began planning. I started by researching the HOA bylaws, city ordinances, and property rights in our county. I discovered something interesting buried deep in the documents. An obscure clause about vehicle compliance for HOA members. Every resident-owned vehicle had to be registered with the HOA, carry updated insurance, and pass certain neighborhood aesthetic requirements. The rules were vague, intentionally vague, but the consequences were severe. Non-compliant vehicles could be towed immediately, without warning. This was my opening. Karen had broken one rule already. She hadn't registered her SUV for the new year. I checked the HOA public parking registry. Her plate number wasn't on it. It was a small violation, but under the bylaws, it was enough to put her on thin ice. Over the next week, I watched her routine. She left for work at exactly 8:12 a.m., coffee cup in hand, sunglasses still glued to her head. She returned around 6:45 p.m., parking in my spot with a little smirk on her face. I started documenting everything, photos, timestamps, even short videos. I made sure to capture every instance of her ignoring the space number clearly painted on the asphalt. The more evidence I gathered, the more I realized this wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about setting a precedent. In this neighborhood, people like Karen had been walking over quieter residents for years. If I could take her down legally, publicly, and permanently, it would send a message to every future would-be tyrant in the HOA. By the end of the month, I had a thick file of evidence and a plan so airtight it would make even Karen's smug smile disappear. The key wasn't just to get her out of my spot. The key was to make sure she could never park anywhere in this neighborhood again. And I was ready to begin. The first step was making sure every move I made was untouchable. Karen was the type who would scream harassment at the first hint of retaliation, so my plan had to be cloaked in the dull, gray camouflage of pure legality. I began with the HOA office. They kept sloppy records, and most residents didn't bother updating them unless they were forced. That sloppiness was now my weapon. I requested a copy of the vehicle compliance roster under the guise of ensuring my own information was correct. Buried halfway down the list, I found my confirmation. Karen's silver SUV was not registered for the year. No insurance on file. No proof of inspection. Technically, according to the bylaws, it was in violation 3 separate times. The rulebook didn't just suggest penalties, it demanded them. Non-compliant vehicles could be fined daily. After a week, they could be towed without notice. And if the violations persisted for more than 30 days, the HOA could revoke parking privileges entirely. Most people never reached that third penalty, but I was going to make sure Karen did. I crafted my first report, attaching clear photographs of her SUV in my spot, highlighting the painted 47. Under her tires, I included time-stamped shots of the license plate and a copy of the HOA roster showing her missing registration. Then I submitted it anonymously through the HOA violation drop box, just as the rules allowed. The beauty of anonymity was that Karen wouldn't know where the pressure was coming from. She'd think it was the HOA itself breathing down her neck. Within a week, notices began appearing on her windshield, small, fluorescent slips, warning her of her noncompliance. I watched from my window as she ripped them off in disgust, crumpling them without reading. She probably thought she could bully her way past them like she bullied past every other rule. But the notices kept coming. The HOA, for all its faults, loved collecting fines. Each violation stacked on top of the last, $50 here, $75 there. By the second week, the penalties had crossed the $500 mark. I could have stopped there, but I had something bigger in mind. While the HOA was tightening the screws from one side, I began pulling in the city's vehicle compliance department. A quick phone call to the motor vehicles office revealed another interesting fact. Karen's SUV registration had expired months ago. The tags on her license plate were out of date. That wasn't just an HOA issue, it was a state offense. I filed a formal complaint with the city, again providing photographs and exact timestamps. Once the city got involved, the matter jumped beyond the HOA jurisdiction. Now, she wasn't just at risk of HOA fines, she was at risk of tickets, impound fees, and court appearances. But I still wasn't satisfied. The final phase of my trap was psychological. I needed Karen to dig herself deeper without realizing it. So, I left my own car parked in a guest space and made sure my assigned spot stayed empty for a few days. I knew she wouldn't be able to resist parking there again. Sure enough, she took the bait. Every time she parked in my space, I added another batch of photos to my growing file. Now, the violations weren't just about registration, they were about trespassing on private property. Under HOA rules, repeated trespassing could trigger a permanent revocation of parking privileges, and permanent meant permanent. No driveway, no curbside, no guest spaces, nothing. If she wanted to keep a car, she'd have to store it outside the neighborhood entirely. By the third week, Karen was trapped on all sides. The HOA had stacked fines high enough to fund their next landscaping project. The city had mailed her 2 official warnings about her expired tags, and my evidence file was thick enough to crush any defense she could dream up. But I wasn't ready to deliver the final blow just yet. The key to a plan like this wasn't speed, it was timing. The longer I let her violate the rules, the more undeniable the case became. I wanted the HOA decision to be automatic, not debatable. I gave it 1 more week, watching her pattern remain exactly the same. Same smug parking in my spot. Same crumpling of notices. Same assumption that she was untouchable. She didn't realize that the moment she had taken my spot for the first time, her clock had started ticking. And now there were only days left. The morning it all came together felt like the air before a summer thunderstorm, heavy, still, and full of quiet electricity. By now, Karen's fines with the HOA had crossed $1,000. Her expired vehicle tags had triggered a city citation, and the grace period to resolve it had already passed. She was deep in violation territory, and she didn't even know the full scope of the trouble closing in. I had timed everything so that the HOA monthly board meeting and the city's vehicle enforcement sweep would align within the same week. It was rare for both forces to be active in the neighborhood at once, and I was about to make sure Karen stood squarely in their shared crosshairs. The night before the meeting, I printed my evidence package, 50 pages of photographs, violation notices, timestamp logs, and a clear timeline of events. Every page was organized so tightly it looked like a legal case file. I dropped it into the HOA president's inbox with a cover note quoting the exact bylaw that allowed for permanent parking privilege revocation. Then I made my final call to the city, letting them know that the silver SUV with expired tags would be parked in violation on HOA property the following morning. I didn't even have to name her. By now, she had her own file with the city. The next day unfolded exactly as I'd envisioned. At 8:12 a.m., Karen left for work in her usual hurry, her SUV rumbling out of my spot. At 6:45 p.m., she returned and slid right back into place, tires crushing the 47 painted beneath her. But this time she wasn't alone for long. At 7:05 p.m., a city enforcement truck rolled into the neighborhood. The officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, walking straight to her SUV. I watched from my upstairs window as he examined the plates, checked the tags, and jotted something down. Then came the bright orange sticker, slapped right across her driver's side window, warning that the vehicle was scheduled for towing if not brought into compliance immediately. Karen stormed outside moments later, tearing the sticker from the glass. She paced around the SUV, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly. I couldn't hear her voice, but I could imagine the tone, sharp, defensive, and utterly convinced she was the victim. The following evening was the HOA board meeting. I didn't attend, I didn't need to. My evidence was enough to speak for me. Later, a sympathetic neighbor who had been there told me it wasn't even a debate. The HOA voted unanimously to revoke Karen's parking privileges for repeated violations, effective immediately. That meant her assigned driveway was gone, guest parking was off limits, and any vehicle she owned parked in the neighborhood could be towed without warning. The best part, because of her outstanding city violations, she couldn't simply sell the SUV and replace it with something else. She would have to pay every fine, renew every registration, and jump through every bureaucratic hoop before she could even think about parking legally again. And even then, it wouldn't be on HOA property. The perfect storm had hit, and she was right in the center of it. The next few days were a slow motion unraveling. She left her SUV parked in my spot, perhaps out of defiance, but by the third morning it was gone, towed away in the early hours. From then on, she was on foot or catching rides from friends. Her once daily routines became irregular. The confident strut she had when she first took my space was gone, replaced by quick, nervous glances toward my window whenever she passed. It wasn't just about the parking spot anymore. The neighborhood had shifted. People had seen that even the most entitled, untouchable resident could be brought down, not with shouting, not with petty arguments, but with patience, precision, and the same rules they want. Weaponized against others, I had my space back, but more importantly, I had set a precedent. Still, I wasn't done. There was one last piece to ensure that Karen could never slip her way back into a position of control. Getting my space back felt satisfying, but satisfaction wasn't the same as security. Karen had been stripped of her parking privileges, and her SUV was gone, but I knew her type. People like her didn't vanish quietly. They schemed, they looked for loopholes, and if there was a way to wriggle back into the neighborhood's good graces, she would find it. That was why the next stage of my plan wasn't about punishment. It was about prevention. I wasn't just going to stop her from parking here now. I was going to make sure she could never park here again. The HOA bylaws had a section most residents never read, the Permanent Restriction Clause. It was designed for chronic violators, people who broke the same rule so many times that the board could impose a lifetime ban. Normally, it was reserved for serious offenses like illegal construction or property damage, but parking was specifically listed as one of the enforceable areas. The problem was, The clause required overwhelming evidence that the violator would continue to break the rule if given the chance. That was where my months of surveillance came in. I compiled every photograph, every timestamp, every fine, every city citation, and every recorded infraction into one final master file. Then I added the piece de resistance, testimony from other neighbors. I went door to door, not asking them to take sides, but simply asking if they had seen Karen parking in my spot. Many had, and their accounts lined up perfectly with my timeline. Some even had their own photos. It was no longer just my word against hers. It was the entire street against her. I submitted the file to the HOA with a formal request under the permanent restriction clause. The board had 30 days to respond, and in that time, Karen tried every angle she could. She wrote letters claiming the fines were unfair. She argued that she had been temporarily reassigned my spot due to neighborhood congestion. She even accused me of staging my evidence. But the board had the photos, the city records, the eyewitness accounts, all pointing to one undeniable truth. The vote was held at the next meeting. It wasn't close, unanimous. Effective immediately, Karen was banned from owning, operating, or parking any vehicle within the HOA jurisdiction for life. This meant more than just losing access to my space or the guest spots. She couldn't park in her own driveway. She couldn't park on the street in front of her home because those were HOA-maintained roads. If she wanted to own a car, she would have to keep it in another neighborhood and walk or get a ride in every day. The news traveled fast. By the next morning, whispers had spread across the cul-de-sac. People peeked through blinds, exchanging knowing looks as Karen stomped out to the curb to meet a rideshare driver. The woman, who had strutted into my spot for a month straight, now had to stand awkwardly at the corner like a visitor in her own neighborhood. I didn't celebrate outwardly, that wasn't my style, but inside there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I had closed every door she could possibly pry open. The ban was airtight, written into the HOA official records, and enforceable by city code if she tried to defy it. Weeks passed. The silver SUV never returned. Karen began avoiding eye contact altogether, walking past my spot without so much as a glance. The once loud enforcer of neighborhood standards had been reduced to a silent shadow, stripped of her favorite weapon, her car. But I knew there was one more move I could make, one final step that would ensure her downfall remained a permanent lesson for the entire HOA. Something public, something that would make every neighbor think twice before trying what she had done. By now, Karen had been effectively neutralized. She couldn't park anywhere in the neighborhood, her SUV was gone, and the HOA had locked the door on her ever-regaining privileges. But I didn't just want her gone, I wanted a warning etched into the collective memory of the neighborhood. Something that would make sure no one else thought about testing the boundaries in. Same way, it wasn't about gloating, it was about precedent. In HOA communities, reputations travel faster than official notices. People remember the cautionary tales, the stories whispered at barbecues and neighborhood watch meetings. I wanted Karen's story to become one of those permanent reminders. The annual HOA community meeting was my stage. Every year, it drew almost every homeowner, a mix of people who cared deeply about neighborhood affairs, and those who simply wanted the free coffee and donuts. This year, the board had agreed to dedicate a section of the agenda to community compliance successes, a bland label for what I knew would be the perfect opportunity. I prepared a short presentation, no personal attacks, no mocking, just a factual, step-by-step breakdown of how the HOA had successfully enforced the bylaws against a chronic violator. The board had approved it in advance, since it doubled as a demonstration of how effective the HOA could be when residents reported issues properly. On the day of the meeting, I sat quietly as other agenda items passed: landscaping budgets, pool repairs, noise complaints. Then the compliance segment began. The president introduced the case without naming names, calling it one of the most thorough and well-documented examples of bylaw enforcement in our community's history. Slide by slide, my evidence appeared on the projector. The numbered parking space clearly marked 47. The SUV parked in it. The violation notices on the windshield, the city's bright orange sticker, the tow truck hauling it away. Each image was met with murmurs and quiet chuckles from the crowd. The board read aloud the clauses from the bylaws that justified each action, making it clear this wasn't a personal vendetta. It was the rules in action. Karen was there, sitting stiffly in the back row. She kept her eyes down, hands clenched in her lap. But the shift in the room was obvious. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around her now saw her as the subject of a case study, not an authority figure. She wasn't feared anymore. She was a warning. By the time the presentation ended, the atmosphere had changed. People were leaning toward each other, whispering, some smiling. A few approached me afterward, quietly thanking me for standing up to her. One even joked that Karen, free parking, should be the new neighborhood motto. The beauty of that meeting was its permanence. The minutes would be recorded and archived, meaning that any future homeowner who asked about parking violations could read about the case in detail. Karen's infamy was now part of the official neighborhood record. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a subtle transformation in the community. People seemed bolder about addressing issues. They spoke up at meetings, filed complaints when necessary, and, most importantly, stopped letting a single overbearing personality control the conversation. The board itself seemed more confident in enforcing rules, knowing they had a successful example to point to. Karen, meanwhile, faded further into the background. Without her SUV, without her ability to intimidate through petty enforcement, she had lost her standing. She still lived in the neighborhood, but she was no longer its self-appointed sheriff. She was just another resident, one with a long walk to wherever she parked her car outside the gates. I could have left it there, content with the quiet victory. But there was one last step I wanted to take, not out of spite, but to ensure that even beyond our neighborhood, Karen would never regain the kind of unchecked control she once wielded here. The final move would take her reputation from local cautionary tale to permanent mark in the broader HOA system. The HOA victory was satisfying, but I knew reputations had a way of healing over time. If Karen simply bided her time, she could eventually move to another HOA community and start over, using the same tactics to bully her way into control. I didn't want my work to be undone somewhere else. I wanted the mark to follow her. Most people don't realize this, but HOA, especially in suburban networks, share more information than residents think. There are regional associations, legal coalitions, and property management companies that oversee multiple neighborhoods. Violation records can be passed along quietly during home sales, especially if a buyer is moving into another HOA-controlled community. So I reached out to the property management company that handled our HOA affairs. I framed it as a professional courtesy, a heads up that a chronic rule violator had been permanently banned from parking in our community and had a long history of ignoring compliance notices. I sent them the same documentation I'd prepared for our board, making sure it was factual and airtight. No insults, no opinions, just a crystal clear record of behavior. The response was immediate and matter of fact. They thanked me for the information, confirmed it would be placed in the management database, and noted that it could be shared with other communities under their jurisdiction. That meant if Karen ever tried to move into one of their other HOA neighborhoods, the board there would see the record before approving her application. And knowing HOA boards, they wouldn't touch her with a 10-foot pole. To seal the deal, I also filed a public record request with the city regarding her vehicle violations. Those citations, once paid or contested, would still appear in municipal records, accessible to anyone doing a background check. They weren't buried somewhere private, they were out in the open, searchable, permanent. It wasn't vindictive, it was insurance. I wasn't just removing a problem from my street, I was preventing it from landing on someone else's. Over the next few months, Karen's presence in the neighborhood shrank to almost nothing. Without a car, she stopped attending most HOA meetings. She stopped patrolling the streets, looking for violations to report. She became, at most, a figure occasionally spotted walking to the bus stop at the far end of the development. My parking spot remained empty whenever I wasn't using it, as if it had been reclaimed by the rightful owner in the truest sense. The asphalt number 47 gleamed from a fresh coat of paint I'd applied myself, a small, private celebration of what I'd won back. Neighbors still asked me now and then how I'd managed to pull it off without a screaming match or a months-long feud. My answer was always the same: patience, precision, and the rules themselves. I hadn't broken a single one. I'd simply understood them better than she had. That was the real checkmate. Not just removing her from my space, not just towing her SUV, not even banning her from parking in the neighborhood. The real victory was ensuring she could never play the same game again, here or anywhere else. And as far as I was concerned, that was the end of it. The street was quiet. The neighborhood was calmer. My space was mine again. Karen's reign as the self-appointed parking queen was over, and the lesson had been carved into the very structure of our community. No one is above the rules, not even the ones who think they right them. The game had ended, and I had won.